The rain came down hard that October evening. Just like in those old movies where everything falls apart. Maya stood in Arjun's tiny apartment, watching him tape up another cardboard box. They'd been together for 3 years, 3 beautiful years that now felt like they were slipping through her fingers like sand. She remembered the exact moment she fell in love with him. It was at a coffee shop near the university, where he'd been showing his short films to anyone who'd watch. His eyes lit up when he talked about storytelling, about capturing real lives and real moments. That passion had drawn her in like a magnet. Now, that same passion was taking him away from her. The apartment looked so empty with half his stuff already packed. His camera equipment sat carefully wrapped in bubble plastic, ready for adventures she wouldn't be part of. Maya felt her chest tighten. Just 2 weeks ago, everything had seemed perfect. Then he got the call about the documentary project in South America. A full year of traveling through remote villages, telling stories that needed to be told. It was his dream opportunity, the kind that comes once in a lifetime. And just 3 days after his good news, her father had called her into his office. The senior partner position at the architecture firm was hers if she wanted it. 5 years of job security, amazing projects, and the chance to design buildings that would stand for generations. Everything she'd worked toward since college. But it came with a catch, a 5-year contract. No extended breaks, no remote work, full commitment. Arjun stopped packing and looked at her. His eyes were red, and she knew he'd been crying earlier when she wasn't looking. They'd spent the last week trying to find solutions, staying up until dawn, talking through every possible option. Could he turn down the project? Could she quit her job? Could they do long distance for a year? But every solution felt like someone had to give up their dreams, and neither of them wanted to be the reason the other person lived with regret. She walked over to him, and he pulled her close. They stood there in the middle of his half-empty apartment, holding on to each other like they could stop time if they just held on tight enough. His t-shirt smelled like the detergent she'd bought him last month. And she tried to memorize everything about this moment. The way his heartbeat sounded against her ear, the warmth of his arms around her shoulders, the soft sound of rain against the windows. They'd talked about marriage once, late at night after watching a friend's wedding. They'd planned out their future in that dreamy way young couples do, thinking love could solve any problem. But life turned out to be more complicated than late-night promises. Love wasn't the issue. They loved each other deeply, truly. But love couldn't change the fact that their dreams were pulling them to opposite ends of the world. Maya pulled back and looked up at him. Tears were running down both their faces now, and neither of them bothered to wipe them away. They both knew what had to happen next. Sometimes loving someone means letting them go, even when everything in you wants to hold on tighter. She kissed him one last time, tasting salt from their mixed tears, trying to pour 3 years of love into one final moment. Then she picked up her jacket from his couch, the one she'd left there so many times before. But this time, she wouldn't be coming back tomorrow to get it. This was goodbye. Real goodbye. The kind that leaves a mark on your soul. She walked to the door, her hand shaking on the doorknob. She wanted to turn around, to run back and tell him they'd figure it out somehow. But she knew that would just make it harder. The rain soaked through her jacket within seconds of stepping outside. She walked to her car in a daze, got in, and just sat there. Through the rain-covered windshield, she could see his apartment window. The light was still on. She wondered if he was watching her leave, or if he'd already gone back to packing his life into boxes. 6 months passed like a blur. Maya threw herself into work with an intensity that worried her friends. She stayed late at the office, took on extra projects, volunteered for the difficult clients nobody else wanted, anything to keep her mind busy. Her colleagues thought she was incredibly dedicated. They didn't know she was just running from her own thoughts. Her best friend Priya tried setting her up on dates. Nice guys, successful guys, guys who wanted relationships and stability. Maya went through the motions. Dinner conversations, polite laughs, goodnight texts. But every date felt like she was acting in a play, reading lines that didn't belong to her. These men weren't bad, they just weren't him. At night, alone in her apartment, the mask would slip. She'd reach for her phone to text Arjun about something funny that happened at work, or to ask his opinion about a design problem. Her fingers would hover over his contact name before she'd catch herself and put the phone down. He was probably in some village without cell service anyway, she'd tell herself. Better to not even try. She rearranged her entire apartment, trying to erase the ghost of their relationship. The corner where they used to sit and watch movies got a new bookshelf. She replaced the couch where they'd spent lazy Sundays reading together. She even changed her sheets, throwing out the blue ones he'd always loved. But none of it helped. The memories weren't in the furniture, they were in her heart, and no amount of redecorating could change that. Maya thought she was doing fine. She told everyone she was fine. Her father praised her dedication at work. Her mother stopped asking worried questions about her eating habits. Priya stopped suggesting blind dates after the fifth one ended, with Maya making polite excuses to leave early. On the surface, everything looked normal, but inside, she felt like she was living someone else's life. Work became her entire world. She'd arrive at the office before sunrise and leave long after sunset. The new building project consumed her days, a 20-story mixed-use complex that would transform an entire neighborhood. She poured everything into it, every design choice, every detail. Her colleagues called her a perfectionist. What they didn't understand was that the work was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. But memories have a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect them. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening in April. Maya was walking home from the office, taking a shortcut through the old downtown district. She'd deliberately avoided this area for months because it held too many reminders. But she was tired. Her feet hurt, and the shortcut would save her 10 minutes. The street musician appeared out of nowhere, sitting on the corner with an old acoustic guitar. Maya was already past him when the first notes reached her ears. She froze, mid-step. That song. That specific song. The melody wrapped around her heart and squeezed. She could suddenly see herself 3 years ago, wearing that green dress, dancing with Arjun at Priya's wedding. His hand on her waist, her head on his shoulder. That song playing as they swayed together. She'd thought about him every day since they broke up, but she'd gotten good at pushing the thoughts away. This was different. This was her body remembering before her mind could stop it. Her hands remembered how his shoulders felt. Her ear remembered the sound of his breathing. Her heart remembered the feeling of complete safety in his arms. The world around her seemed to blur. People rushed past on their way home, cars honked in traffic, the city hummed with its usual chaos. But Maya stood frozen on that sidewalk, tears streaming down her face, unable to move. The musician kept playing, completely unaware that his song was breaking someone's heart into pieces all over again. How long did she stand there? 10 minutes? 20? An hour? Time lost all meaning. All she knew was the ache in her chest and the memories flooding through her mind. Arjun bringing her coffee every Sunday morning. Always exactly how she liked it. The way he'd sit cross-legged on her floor, sketching little cartoons in the margins of her architectural drawings while she worked late. How he'd call her in the middle of the day just to say he missed her voice. The time he drove 4 hours in a snowstorm because she'd had a bad day at work and needed a hug. She remembered their last real fight, 3 weeks before the breakup. It had been about something stupid. She couldn't even remember what. But she remembered how they'd made up. Both apologizing at the same time. Both laughing at how they'd said the exact same words. That was them, always in sync, always on the same wavelength. Until they weren't. Someone touched her shoulder gently. Maya blinked and found Priya standing beside her, concern written all over her face. Her friend didn't ask questions, didn't offer empty reassurances. She just took Maya's arm and guided her to a nearby bench. They sat together in silence while Maya cried, really cried. For the first time since the breakup, the musician had moved on to a different song. Something cheerful and upbeat that felt wrong against Maya's grief. Priya handed her tissues from her purse, the same way she'd done 100 times over their 15-year friendship. When Maya could finally speak, her voice came out rough and broken. She told Priya everything. How she still reached for her phone to text him at least 5 times a day. How she'd driven past his old apartment twice last month, just to see if his car was there. knowing perfectly well he was thousands of miles away. How she'd deleted and re-downloaded his pictures from her phone at least 10 times. How every architectural achievement felt hollow because he wasn't there to celebrate with her. How she'd convinced herself she was moving on, but she'd just been lying to herself. Priya listened without judgment, holding her friend's hand. When Maya finally ran out of words, Priya said something simple but profound. She said that forgetting someone isn't about deleting their number or avoiding places you went together. Real forgetting happens in the heart, and some hearts just don't know how to let go. Maybe, Priya suggested gently, Maya wasn't supposed to forget. Maybe she was fighting against something that was trying to tell her the truth. That night, Maya went home and stopped pretending. She pulled out the box she'd hidden in the back of her closet. The one with his old t-shirt and the birthday cards he'd made her, and the ticket stubs from movies they'd watched. She sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by memories, and let herself feel everything she'd been running from. The love, the loss, the longing, all of it. She looked at a photo from their trip to the mountains 2 years ago. They were sitting on a rock overlooking a valley, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said. They looked so happy, so sure of their future together. What had happened to those people? When had life gotten so complicated that love stopped being enough? Maya realized something as she sat there, surrounded by the remnants of their relationship. She'd been trying to forget Arjun like he was a bad habit she needed to break. But he wasn't a habit. He was a person who'd changed her life, who'd shown her what real love felt like. Forgetting him would mean forgetting the best parts of herself, the parts that had bloomed in the warmth of being truly loved. She put the items carefully back in the box, but didn't hide it in the closet this time. Instead, she placed it on her bookshelf. Not as a shrine to the past, but as an acknowledgement of the truth. She'd loved him. She still loved him. And pretending otherwise wasn't protecting her heart. It was just making her miserable. The gallery opening wasn't somewhere Maya wanted to be. Her friend Nisha had been pestering her for weeks to come to her photography exhibition, and Maya had run out of excuses. So there she was on a Friday evening in May, wearing a black dress she didn't care about, holding a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, trying to look interested in photographs of urban landscapes. The gallery was crowded with the usual art scene people, photographers and artists, collectors and critics, all talking in that animated way people do at these events. Maya drifted through the rooms, genuinely admiring Nisha's work. Her friend had captured the city in ways Maya had never noticed, finding beauty in ordinary street corners and forgotten alleyways. She was standing in front of a photograph of a sunrise over the old train station when she felt it. That electricity in the air that happens when someone's watching you. Maya turned slowly, and her heart stopped. Across the crowded room, standing next to a pillar, was Arjun. He looked different. Thinner, with sun-darkened skin and longer hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore a simple gray shirt and jeans, nothing fancy. But he'd never needed fancy to take her breath away. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the entire gallery seemed to disappear. 8 months of separation vanished in that single look. Maya's first instinct was to run. Her second was to cross the room and throw her arms around him. Instead, she stood frozen, clutching her wineglass so hard her knuckles turned white. Arjun started walking toward her, weaving through the crowd, never breaking eye contact. Her heart hammered so hard, she could hear it over the gallery music. They stood facing each other in the middle of the room, surrounded by strangers and noise, and Nisha's photographs. Neither of them seemed to know what to say. Finally, Arjun spoke first, his voice exactly as she remembered it, warm and a little rough around the edges. He said her name like a question and a statement all at once. They fell into the awkward small talk of ex-lovers trying to be polite. Yes, she was still at the architecture firm. The senior partner position was going well. That big project she'd mentioned was nearly complete. And him? He'd come back early from South America. The documentary was filmed, now it was in editing. He was staying with his brother for a few weeks before heading to his next project. Every word felt both too much and not enough. They were talking about buildings and filming schedules when what Maya really wanted to ask was whether he still thought about her at 2 a.m. Whether he'd found someone new, whether leaving had been as hard for him as being left had been for her. But you can't ask those questions in a crowded gallery with people brushing past you to look at photographs. Somehow they ended up on the gallery's balcony. The May evening was warm, and the street below hummed with Friday night traffic. Out here, away from the crowd, the awkwardness softened a little. They stood side by side at the railing, not quite touching, both staring at the city lights instead of each other. Arjun started talking about South America. He described villages tucked into mountains, where people lived without electricity but with a richness of community Maya couldn't imagine. He talked about an elderly woman who'd shared her life story through an interpreter, bringing him to tears with her resilience and joy. He described sunsets over jungles, the sounds of rivers at night, the taste of food he couldn't name but would never forget. But then his voice changed, got quieter. He said that every beautiful sunset reminded him of the ones they'd watched together from her apartment. Every time he'd captured a perfect moment on camera, his first thought was wishing he could show her. He'd written her emails he never sent, had imaginary conversations with her in his head, found himself looking for her face in every crowd, even though he knew she was thousands of miles away. Maya's throat tightened. She told him about designing her first building, about seeing her vision take shape in steel and glass, about the moment the construction crew placed the final beam and everyone celebrated, how she'd smiled and accepted congratulations, but inside she felt empty because the one person she wanted to share it with wasn't there. She told him about the rearranged apartment, the deleted photos, the failed dates, about standing on a sidewalk crying because a street musician played their song. They talked until the gallery staff started giving them pointed looks, clearly wanting to close up. Nisha found them on the balcony and raised her eyebrows, but didn't say anything, just hugged them both and told them to lock up when they left since she was the last staff member there. So they walked. Neither of them suggested it. They just started walking through the city streets like they had 1,000 times before. Past the coffee shop where they'd met, past the park where he'd first told her he loved her, past the bookstore where they'd spent entire Saturdays browsing. Every corner held a memory. And tonight, for the first time in months, those memories didn't hurt quite so much. They talked about everything and nothing, work and family and friends and dreams. The conversation flowed easily, falling back into their old rhythm like they'd never been apart. But underneath every casual word ran a current of everything unsaid. The love that never went away, the regret of letting each other go, the question neither of them dared to ask. What now? Around midnight, they ended up at an all-night diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tastes like it's been sitting on the burner too long. They slid into their old booth, the one in the back corner where they used to come after late movies. The waitress, who remembered them, smiled sadly and brought them coffee without asking. Arjun reached across the table and took her hand. The touch sent electricity through Maya's entire body. His thumb traced circles on her palm, a gesture so familiar it made her want to cry. He said he'd thought about her every single day. That coming back to the city and not seeing her had felt wrong. That running into her tonight felt like the universe giving him a second chance he didn't deserve. Maya looked at their joined hands and felt 8 months of walls crumbling. She'd worked so hard to protect herself, to move on, to be practical and sensible. But sitting here with him, feeling his skin against hers, hearing his voice say her name, all that work felt pointless. You can't logic your way out of loving someone. The heart doesn't care about practicality. They stayed at that diner until 3 a.m., until the waitress gently told them she needed to close. They walked to Maya's car, still holding hands, neither wanting the night to end. When they reached her car, Arjun pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a hug that felt like coming home. She buried her face in his chest and felt his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong and real. After that night at the gallery, Maya and Arjun fell into a pattern that felt both wonderful and heartbreaking. They met for coffee the next day. Just coffee, they both said. Just two old friends catching up. But coffee turned into a 3-hour conversation that left them both smiling. So they met again 2 days later. Just dinner, nothing serious. Except dinner turned into walking through the city until midnight, talking about everything under the stars. Within a week, They were seeing each other almost every day. They didn't talk about what they were doing or what it meant. They just existed together, grabbing these moments like precious stolen things. Maya would finish work and find him waiting outside her building. Arjun would text her photos from his editing sessions, asking her opinion on shots he was considering. They fell back into each other's lives, like water filling a space it had always belonged in. But the elephant in the room kept getting bigger. Arjun had another project lined up, this time in Kenya. 6 months of filming wildlife conservation efforts across national parks. It was another dream opportunity, the kind that would establish his reputation as a serious documentary filmmaker. He was supposed to leave in 5 weeks. Every day that passed felt like borrowed time. Maya's career was taking off in ways she'd always hoped for. The building she designed was almost complete, and she'd been approached about leading an even bigger project. A whole new urban development, the kind of work that could define her entire career. It would require 2 years of intensive involvement, constant presence, dozens of meetings and site visits. The kind of commitment you can't do remotely. They tried to pretend the countdown wasn't happening. They focused on the present, on each moment they had together. Movie nights at her apartment, where they'd fall asleep on the couch tangled together. Early morning walks before work, sharing coffee and conversation as the city woke up. Lazy Sunday afternoons where they'd just exist together, him editing footage on his laptop while she sketched building designs at her dining table. But the unspoken truth hung over everything. They were falling in love all over again. Maybe had never stopped being in love. And they were heading for the same cliff they'd fallen off 8 months ago. The same impossible choice between love and dreams, between each other and the futures they'd worked so hard to build. One evening, they were sitting on her couch after another bittersweet goodbye was imminent. The conversation had been light, avoiding the serious topics they both knew needed addressing. But then Arjun's phone rang. His producer, calling about final arrangements for Kenya. Maya watched his face light up as he talked about the project, seeing the excitement and passion in his eyes. When he hung up, the silence between them felt heavy. She asked him if he was excited about Kenya. He said yes, but his voice lacked conviction. She could see the war happening behind his eyes. The same war she'd been fighting since the gallery. Then he asked her about the new development project, and she found herself unable to meet his eyes as she talked about it. Because how could she tell him that every professional achievement felt empty when he wasn't there to share it? They tried to convince themselves that they could be just friends, that they could care about each other from a distance, cheer each other on from separate continents, be happy for each other's successes even if they couldn't be together. But every accidental touch contradicted that lie. Every lingering look revealed the truth. Friends didn't look at each other the way they did. Friends didn't feel their hearts race when the other person walked into a room. The breaking point came after another evening together. They'd cooked dinner at her place, working side by side in her small kitchen like they'd done hundreds of times before. The domesticity of it, the easy rhythm of moving around each other, the shared laughter over a nearly burned sauce. It all felt so right. When Arjun left that night, Maya stood in her doorway watching him walk away, and something inside her shattered. She called Priya at midnight, crying so hard she could barely speak. Her friend came over immediately, found Maya sitting on her kitchen floor, surrounded by the dinner dishes they'd left. Priya sat down beside her and just listened as Maya poured out everything. How she'd tried so hard to move on, to be practical, to protect herself. How seeing Arjun again had brought everything flooding back. How she was terrified that she'd spend the rest of her life wondering what if. The next morning, Maya went to work exhausted and emotionally drained. She moved through her meetings on autopilot, reviewing designs and approving changes without really seeing them. Her father, who'd been watching her carefully for weeks, called her into his office at the end of the day. Maya expected a lecture about her distraction, about needing to focus on the important projects ahead. What she got instead changed everything. Her father sat her down and told her a story she'd never heard before. 30 years ago, before he met Maya's mother, he'd been in love with someone else, a woman who wanted to travel, to see the world, to live without roots. He'd had a choice: follow his heart or follow his career plan. He chose the career. He'd convinced himself it was the right decision, The practical decision. He'd built a successful firm, married a good woman, had a family. But there was a piece of him, he said quietly, that never stopped wondering what if. He told Maya he saw himself in her. That same look of someone trying to choose between love and logic. He asked her a simple question that cut right through all her defenses. If she kept choosing her career over Arjun, would she look back in 30 years with satisfaction or regret? Buildings would always be there to design. Projects would always come up. But the right person, the one who makes your heart remember even when you try to forget, that person might not wait forever. Maya left her father's office in a daze. She drove home without really seeing the roads, her mind spinning. That night, she sat alone in the living room of the apartment she'd designed so carefully. Surrounded by furniture she'd chosen to erase memories of Arjun. She looked at the building plans spread across her dining table, the career path laid out before her so clearly. Then she looked at her phone, at Arjun's contact, at all the texts they'd exchanged over the past few weeks. For 8 months, she'd been trying to convince herself that she could build a life around the hole he'd left behind. That eventually, the emptiness would fade, and she'd find happiness in her work, in her accomplishments, in a future that made sense on paper. But sitting there in the silence, she finally admitted the truth. She didn't want a life that made sense on paper. She wanted a life that made her heart feel full. And her heart, despite everything she'd done to quiet it, kept calling his name. Maya didn't sleep that night. She sat at her dining table with her laptop open, researching until sunrise. Architecture firms in East Africa, building projects in Kenya, urban development opportunities in growing African cities, remote work possibilities, international certifications, housing markets in Nairobi. Every search led to another, and slowly, impossibly, a plan began to take shape in her mind. By morning, she'd made a list. Not a fantasy wish list, but a real, practical plan with actual steps. She looked at her calendar. Arjun was leaving in 3 weeks. That gave her 3 weeks to either act on this or let him go forever. 3 weeks to choose between the safe path she'd been walking and the terrifying leap her heart was begging her to take. The next few days passed in a blur of difficult conversations. She sat down with her father first, laying out her idea. She didn't want to give up architecture, but she wanted to know if the firm could support a different arrangement. Remote work for some projects, international partnerships, maybe even opening a satellite office focused on sustainable development in growing markets. Her father listened, and instead of the resistance she'd expected, he saw possibility. They spent hours working through the details, discussing what might actually work. Then came the harder conversation with the partners about the urban development project. She was honest with them. She wanted the project, but not if it meant sacrificing everything else in her life. She proposed bringing in an associate to work alongside her, someone who could handle the on-site presence when she needed flexibility. To her surprise, they didn't dismiss the idea immediately. They asked for time to consider it, to see if they could make the arrangement work. Maya barely let herself hope. She kept researching, kept planning, treating it like any architectural project, breaking down the impossible into manageable steps, identifying problems and finding solutions. But she didn't tell Arjun any of it. Not yet, because if it all fell apart, if the firm said no, if the plan turned out to be impossible, she didn't want to give him hope, only to crush it again. 10 days before his flight to Kenya, Maya's father called her into his office. The partners had agreed to a trial arrangement, 6 months working remotely from wherever she needed to be, with 2 trips back for critical meetings. If the project stayed on track, they'd consider making the arrangement permanent. It wasn't perfect, but it was possible. Actually, realistically possible. That evening, Maya stood outside Arjun's brother's apartment for 10 minutes before she could make herself knock. Her heart pounded so hard she felt lightheaded. What if he'd moved on? What if 3 weeks had been enough for him to remember why they'd broken up in the first place? What if she was about to make a complete fool of herself? But then she thought about her father's words, about spending 30 years wondering what if. She knocked. Arjun opened the door looking confused. Probably because she'd never shown up unannounced before. He was wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt. His hair messy, like he'd been running his hands through it. Before he could ask why she was there, before she could lose her courage, Maya started talking. The words poured out in a rush. 8 months of feelings she'd tried to suppress. She told him she'd spent 8 months lying to herself, pretending she could forget him, convincing herself that practical choices mattered more than love, going through the motions of moving on while her heart stayed stuck in the moment she walked out of his apartment in the rain. She told him about standing on the sidewalk, crying when a street musician played their song, about how every achievement felt hollow without him there, about realizing that she'd been trying to erase the best part of herself. Arjun stood in the doorway, frozen. As she continued, she told him about her father's story, about the woman he'd let go, and 30 years of wondering, about the research she'd done, the conversations she'd had with the firm, the plan she'd put together. She wasn't asking him to give up his dreams or change his plans. She wasn't asking him to stay or to wait. She was telling him she wanted to come with him. She'd found architectural projects in East Africa that needed expertise, sustainable housing developments, urban planning initiatives, conservation-focused construction. She could work remotely for her firm while building connections in new markets. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be the straight career path she'd planned. But it would be real. It would be hers. And it would be with him. If he still wanted that. Arjun's eyes filled with tears. He pulled her inside the apartment and just held her for a long moment, his face buried in her hair. When he finally pulled back, he was laughing and crying at the same time. He told her he'd been trying to figure out how to ask her to wait for him, that he'd been rehearsing speeches about doing long distance, about finding a way to make it work even when everything seemed impossible. He'd never imagined she'd want to come with him. They spent that night on his brother's couch, talking through every detail. The logistics, the challenges, the fears, the possibilities. It wouldn't be simple. There would be adjustments and compromises and moments of doubt. They'd be building a life together while also building their individual careers, and that balance would take constant work. But for the first time in 8 months, Maya felt like she could breathe fully. The next 3 weeks were chaos. Visa applications and vaccination appointments, storage arrangements for her furniture, detailed project handoffs at work, saying goodbye to friends and family, explaining her decision 100 times to people who thought she was crazy. Her mother cried, worried about her daughter moving so far away. Priya threw her a going-away party and made her promise to video call every week. Her father hugged her tight and told her he was proud of her for being braver than he'd been. The night before their flight, Maya stood in her empty apartment one last time. She'd sold most of her furniture, put some things in storage, packed the essentials into 2 large suitcases. The apartment that had been her sanctuary, her carefully designed space, now echoed with emptiness. But she didn't feel sad. She felt light, like she'd finally put down a weight she'd been carrying for too long. Arjun picked her up at dawn. They loaded her suitcases into his car and drove to the airport in the soft morning light. At the check-in counter, as they handed over their passports and boarding passes, Maya felt a flutter of nerves. This was real. She was actually doing this. Leaving behind the life she'd planned for one she was choosing moment by moment. On the plane, as they taxied down the runway, Arjun reached over and took her hand. His palm was warm against hers, his grip steady and sure. Maya looked at their joined hands and thought about the gallery night when they'd reconnected, how every touch had felt like coming home. She thought about all the months she'd spent trying to forget him, fighting against what her heart knew to be true. As the plane lifted off, leaving everything familiar behind, Maya realized something important. She hadn't failed at forgetting him. Her heart had succeeded at remembering what mattered most. Some loves aren't meant to be forgotten or moved past. They're meant to be honored, fought for, chosen again and again even when the path forward isn't clear. She'd tried to be practical, to make the safe choice, to protect herself from hurt. But the safest choice turned out to be the scariest one, trusting that love was worth the risk. She leaned her head on Arjun's shoulder as the city disappeared below them, clouds gathering outside the window. They were heading into uncertainty, into a future they'd have to build together with no clear blueprint. Her career would look different now. His work would have new challenges. They'd face obstacles they couldn't even imagine yet, but they'd face them together. And that made all the difference. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop trying to silence your heart and start listening to what it's been trying to tell you all along.